everyone for today's webinar, and thank you all for joining us. This is obviously a very big change for both our members who are currently employed on senior staff contracts, and also those of our members who aspire to one day hold one of those senior staff. We're extremely proud to have reached this point. I think for a long time I didn't think we'd ever get there. So I'm really delighted to be able to talk through some of the changes that are happening, that are already in place, and the things that will change in a little while. I have a section at the end where I've got a couple of frequently asked questions, but the point of today is for people to be able to ask questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Brenda and Gordon are both online as well, so they will be monitoring the chat, and we'll probably try and address those towards the end unless something comes up that's sort of timely. So I thought that the first thing that we should do, and this is really just probably an exercise for myself, is to just reflect on how we got to where we are now. So prior to 93, all senior staff employees were employed under an award, either the Local Government Senior Officers Award or the Local Government State Award. And then from 1993 onwards, senior staff could continue to be employed under the award or a council's enterprise agreement. But if they were designated senior staff by the council, they would be employed on performance-based term contracts of between 12 months and 5 years duration. And that's been the case since 93. Those contracts then became statutory contracts, and so very little of the contract was able to be amended or be flexible in any way. There were obviously renewal requirements, and obviously the biggest problem from our perspective was always that these employees had no guaranteed permanency of employment beyond the term of their contract, and no access to unfair dismissal or the IRC, and were subject to basically the whims of those senior general managers and pressure from councils in terms of their ongoing employment. So I think the LGEA itself has been historically opposed to these contracts and has worked tirelessly throughout the years to try and bring about a change. This is a hangover from the state public sector, who utilised these contracts for their own staff, which is how they became something that local government also utilised. But those contracts have been gone from the public sector for at least 5 years. So local government has been lagging behind in that space. Oh, hit the wrong button. Certainly the biggest change that I am aware of, because this is from my involvement, was in September 2019, when we surveyed our members on senior staff contracts. There's a little excerpt from the joint correspondence that went out. So all 3 industry unions sent out a survey that each union member could fill out at their own relevant link. This is in September 2019. It was as we headed into negotiations for the new state award, but it was our intention then to really do something about this, an issue that we had felt was an issue for some time. And so we surveyed all of the members. LGEA also surveyed their membership, and discussions commenced during those award negotiations about whether or not we could really bring our senior staff, other than general managers, back under the award. And then in March 2020, something came along which kind of ruined all of those negotiations, and COVID really rained on the parade of those negotiations, because things became much more narrower in focus with all of the uncertainty that was taking place across New South Wales, Australia, and the world. We continued to have discussions though, whilst they didn't happen within the award. The LGEA is party to a group called the Employment Matters Reference Group, where we meet every 6 weeks with representatives from the Office of Local Government, LGNSW, DEPA, the USU, and the LGEA, and we talk about employment matters, hence the name. So this has been a topic that we have been regularly discussing every 6 weeks with not just the industry and award parties, but also with the government and the relevant people within the Office of Local Government. So there's been an awareness under the Liberal government, and now under the Labor government that this has been a priority issue for our members and for members of the other unions. But the big change for us, the catalyst, came in March 2021 when ICAC released their report into Operation Dasher, which was an investigation into the conduct of the councillors of the former Canterbury City Council and others. Basically, ICAC identified that the no reason termination aspect of contracts for non-general manager senior staff was a corruption risk. It was able to be used by councillors to pressure GMs to terminate senior staff and replace those senior staff with candidates of their own choosing with little repercussions, because these employees had no recourse. There was no reason needed to be given to terminate these employees. They could simply be marched. And with the release of this report, it really breathed some new life into our discussions around the removal of these contracts and really added some urgency. Ironic that it's 2021, but it did add some urgency in our discussions around why we needed to get rid of these contracts, because now the discussion wasn't only about our claim, which was we wanted our members to have more employment security, but also it was a risk now for councils as well, and an identified risk. And as of 2021, the biggest change was that LGNSW then came on board with also supporting the removal of these contracts from the industry. And so in 2021, those discussions continued. In 2022, in 2023, in 2022 and 23, we went through all of the processes with the Office of Local Government. There was a discussion paper released where councils were invited to respond to the proposed changes. Then there was a change of government and things sort of sat relatively stagnant for all of last year, I think, from March. But this year we've finally done it. The bill was passed by both houses of Parliament on the 16th of May and assented to on the 31st of May. And so that means those changes are now in place. Some happen now and some happen in a few months' time. But as you can see there, we've got Gordon from the LGEA, we've got Graham from the USU, and Ian from Deeper with Minister for IR, Sophie Kotsis. A very proud day for us to have that bill finally passed and to have won that increased employment security for our members, as I said earlier, both in those roles and also those that one day aspire to hold those roles in the future. So when the ministers spoke to support the bill, a lot of them identified that it was the intent was to reduce potential corruption. You can see here Minister Kotsis talked about removing that insecurity of employment for senior staff and the corruption risk that ICAC had identified, and to address that insecurity of employment, allow them to have access to the IRC. Dr. Amanda Combe from the Greens also talked about how this was important in terms of the public trust aspect. You'll see that in her comments in support, she referenced the fact that the parties to the award supported the bill and mentioned sort of some of the feedback that we had provided to these people around additional protections, the need for unfair dismissal, expanding the access to the IRC, and how that was going to be a good thing, not just for employees, but also for the industry as a whole. And the Honourable Bob Namber also referenced specifically some of the experiences of our members. So I've been informed that there are more than 20 members of the LGEA who have had employment terminated under the no reason termination provisions of the statutory contract for senior staff employees. And then talks about how, as we know, because those are our members that he's talking about, it's a really devastating process where we see people who've potentially moved to a regional town, moved their families. They might have a husband who's worked, gotten work in another place, and kids who may be in school, parents perhaps in carers' responsibilities. Everyone's uprooted to move to a regional town, for example, and if they could just one day get an hour's notice to pack their office up and walk out the door, it's incredibly disruptive for that employee, but also for everyone who's left behind at the council. So we're delighted to have achieved this significant change for our members in local government in those senior staff roles. So, as I said earlier, some of the changes take effect from now and some of them take effect in August. What happens now? So employees who are currently employed on a senior staff contract have immediate protection from unfair dismissal, must be covered by an industrial instrument such as an award or enterprise agreement. Statutory contracts for existing senior staff are deemed to be that industrial instrument to enliven the protection from unfair dismissal. We actually had an email just came across my desk just before we started questioning how employees could have access to unfair dismissal if they earn over that cap. And that is the clever way that has been put together to work, so that whilst you are on a senior staff contract, your contract is deemed to be an industrial instrument, and that is the mechanism by which you then have access to the unfair dismissal, even if you earn above that earnings cap. And you also now immediately have access or have the right to request transition to employment under an award or an enterprise agreement. I spoke to LGNSW this morning to ask if they had many people transition yet, and the indications were that he said, Adam Danzig, their manager, said to me that he had sent out only yesterday, for example, template contracts and advice to at least 5 different councils. So it appears to us that there are members probably who have already transitioned, or those who are in the processes of looking into transitioning to the award already. Then the changes that take effect after 1 August, not quite now, is that there'll be no more senior staff contracts able to be made, no new statutory contracts, and no renewals of existing statutory contracts. And then the Act changes where all the references to senior staff will be removed and replaced with GM where relevant. So the transitional arrangements, what do they look like? Those employees on senior staff contracts can elect to continue on those contracts until they expire or are terminated, and we'll talk a bit about what that looks like in a moment. But the provisions of the Act are in force and continue to apply to those senior staff while they remain on the contract, with obviously the access to the unfair dismissal being a big change that all senior staff, non-general manager senior staff, now have access to. Whilst on a grandfathered contract, senior staff are not covered by an award or an enterprise agreement made by the IRC, but do have protection from unfair dismissal. And the contract, as I said earlier, is deemed to be an industrial instrument. They have a right to request transition to employment under an award or enterprise agreement, and that request cannot be unreasonably refused by the employer. And in the event of a dispute about transition, they may seek the assistance of the IRC, who can determine the outcome by making an order. So this is a new thing. The IRC won't have dealt with this before because we've just created this dispute process effectively for any employee who elects to transition. But effectively what that means is if I'm Director of Engineering, heaven help us all, and I seek to transition to employment under the award, and I make that request and my employer says no, I can seek the assistance of the Commission if I believe that that request has been unreasonably refused. So there's some factors to consider when transitioning to the award. The annual pay increase is one that's pretty relevant and timely at the moment. Award employees would have had their increase under the state award this week, on the first pay period on or from 1 July. So what does that mean? Award employees will have received 3.5% increase in salary, and also a one-off payment of an above award payment, $1,000 or 0.5% of your salary system rate of pay, whichever is the greater. So if you transition next week, you've missed the pay increase. I had a discussion with LGNSW about that today because obviously that's pretty relevant, timely consideration. Under the standard contract, the one that senior staff would be currently employed on, you have your annual increases determined by the SORT annual determination, but that's currently frozen. So that's frozen until the 25-26 financial year. A pay increase is payable on your anniversary date from what the contract states. So some senior staff employees who transition might have had a pay increase now and then go across. That's fine. But if you haven't had one and you're due one and you've missed the award one, the advice that I would give any member of the LGEA is to negotiate that into any discussions around what you transition into. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Well, in fact, we can talk about it now. So the rate of pay is something to consider as well. So you have to transfer across kind of where the salary system rates will be. And I'm very aware that there will be plenty of councils out there that don't have a salary system rate of pay that is the correct, like that matches what our senior staff members are receiving. The advice that went out in the OLG circular on the 12th of June to all councils is that no employee should suffer a reduction in transitioning over to the award. We were very clear that had to be made clear to councils. We don't want people having to go backwards in pay to move to what we say are superior employment conditions under the award, and obviously certainly better employment security. But it is something to consider, rates of pay, where you fit within the council's salary structure, but it's also relevant to think about, obviously, as a senior staff employee, you would be employed on a TRP, which doesn't really give you much of a breakdown. As an award employee, you have things to think about. So what are the hours expectation? What are the allowances payable to me under the award to CLA? How do I make sure that that is captured? So those are all, and superannuation as well. So obviously under a TRP, if the SGC goes up, that is absorbed by your package, is the way most councils go about that. That obviously changes then once you go under the award. So there's lots of things to think about. Some councils might still elect to offer you a TRP as an award employee, but it's just really important to make sure that you sit down and look at all of the payments that you're entitled to under the award to make sure that that amount of money that you transition across from is still the correct amount. Hours of work, as I said, we are aware that often a senior staff employee works pretty significant hours, and there will often be requirements to attend things like council meetings. Under the award, you're employed for a 35-hour week. We do have a provision within the state award called excess hours agreements, where an employee can request to enter into an agreement with their employer for effectively incidental overtime. So they can demonstrate, really, my job's really needs about 38 hours a week, for example, in order for me to fulfill all my duties. There's a requirement for an excess hours agreement to pay a 10% allowance, no less than 10%. It can be more. But that is something that you could potentially enter into in transition to say, look, this 10% or whatever is in exchange for me attending your council meetings and working effectively a 38-hour week. It doesn't stop you from earning overtime where you are directed to work overtime, but the excess hours agreements are really there for employees who really can't do their job in 35, but can do it in 37 or 38, but don't want to be a 38-hour employee, want that flexibility of acknowledgement between the parties that we know you're not working just 35, we'll pay you a 10% to make sure that your allowance effectively captures the hours of work that you're actually putting in. The other thing to think about is the right to disconnect. So this was something that we won in the award from 1 July last year. So employees in local government all have an award right to disconnect from work outside of working hours. An employer can't require you to be available. A provision of a phone or a laptop is not, then it doesn't then equate to you expected to be available outside of working hours on weekends. this is a new thing, but I think it will be quite relevant in discussions with senior staff around hours and transition under the award, because that right will be there once you are an award employee. I feel like I've missed this. So on what grounds could a council reasonably refuse a request to transition? These are questions that we've had so far, but I'm very open. I can see the chat popping up. So I'll look to those in a moment. But if we talk about now, what grounds could a council reasonably refuse a request transition? Not many, in my view. I haven't seen many of these as yet. Realistically, the discussions when we've sort of spitballed this with the industry parties, I think the only time would be where a council could reasonably demonstrate that the position is truly a term position. It's not an ongoing role. Other than that, I think it would be really interesting to see what other grounds a council could refuse a request. But in our view, it's really going to be where they can say, well, actually, we're not going to have that director of engineering role as of the end of that contract. It was just in place for this project or whatever it might be. Can you be offered a new senior staff contract now? Yes, but it needs to be signed and sorted out before 1 August. So after 1 August, no new contracts can be entered into. Technically, an employer could offer you one now, but they'd have to enact it pretty quickly. And I believe that the advice, from LGNSW to their staff has been, don't do it. But if you are going to do it, you've got a very small window in which to do it in. Can I be offered employment on a term contract under the award? You can, but only in certain circumstances. So a term contract, they're only able to be offered to employees where there is a genuine term nature to the role. They can't be used as a device to dismiss. But it has to be where the nature of the work is not ongoing. I suspect that that is unlikely to apply to any senior staff positions. So it's our expectation that if there are contracts being offered, they will not be term-based. And I know LGNSW have been providing councils with template contracts, and they are not they're not term-based contracts. They're just award-based contracts that go into some of the details around hours and those sorts of things. Will I have to take a pay cut to transition to award employment? No. So as I said, the advice from the OLG was really clear in that circular that employees were not to suffer a disadvantage in transitioning over to employment under the award. I missed it. That's gone. I might go now to the chat. Oh, have you been answering those for everyone, Gordon? Oh, did I have a typo in my slide? Sorry.
I have been answering them. I'm not sure how accurately, but I had a go.
That's great. Okay, so there's a question here from Ian. Where there is a significant gap between award pay and salary system and the TRP under the old contract, as you transition to the award, are you entitled to the ongoing award increases, or is your pay frozen until the salary system catches up? As an award employee, you should get your award increase. I don't think there will be many councils out there that will have salary systems that have a spot for you. In my experience, not many councils have salary systems above sort of 4-1. And there has been some discussion around whether or not in the next round of award negotiations we revisit that. I think it's important to remember that not all senior staff have been employed on contracts. There have been a small select group of our members certainly that have just continued to be award employees throughout. So we know that the award's already set up for these people because there's senior staff out there employed under the award and have been for years. But yeah, I don't anticipate issue. I'd certainly say that you should get your award increases if you transition across to award employment. Does anyone else have any questions?
Alicia, is that is that still the case if you're on significantly more than the award and the salary system? Like I know our council doesn't, and it goes up to 4-1, but even when they include 4-4, our directors are paid significantly more than that 4-4 with the 10% salary steps and the 10% sort of like a excess hours agreement and even a 10% increase in there. We're still, even with the existing award at the moment, we don't get near what we're on as a contract. So I know I get preserved arrangements if I transition across. I don't lose anything from there. But if you're still well out of step with the salary system, are you simply held on that rate until the salary system catches up?
No, there's no requirement under the award. There's no sort of caveat under the award increases. They're payable to anyone covered by the award. The only other thing I would note is that the award is a minimum rates award. So the rates of pay that are set in the state award are just a starting point. Most councils all pay well in excess of those rates of pay. But if you are outside of the thought bubble of your council salary system, if you are an award employee, you still get your annual increase. You don't have progression opportunities through your salary system, perhaps. Like that's the gap. But your award increase should be payable.
That's different to where we've transferred wrapped up old enterprise agreements, and we've had staff that do stay on a preserved benefit until the award catches up, like the new enterprise agreement catches up with them. So that's different to how it's operated in the past.
So have you got an enterprise agreement in place at your council? Is that?
We've had old enterprise agreements in place at our council, yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say without obviously seeing it, but in my view, those poo rules shouldn't apply to award increases. I can see you nodding, Gordon. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do, because of the point that you made about the award being a minimum rates award. So, I mean, one of the good things. I mean, there's many good things, and I think I've said this before. I just think the way this has been managed and handled by Alicia's been really top class, because it's been difficult and it's been something that we've been seeking to achieve for many years. But the way in which it works is that you will have the opportunity under the award to negotiate a whole bunch of things that you currently can't through the statutory contract. The statutory contract certainly limited the areas that you can negotiate. And I noticed Bede's got a question around unwrapping excess hours and then perhaps recalculating from the TRP and then recalculating in the form of an excess hours working agreement. That's all doable, but it can be a lot more simple and flexible than that, provided that the arrangement you're on leaves you better off than what the award would provide you with. Then it's likely to be considered a valid arrangement. So for that point, I think that there's certainly been no conversation in the meetings I've been at that people's rates of pay will be frozen, because it's anticipated, just like a lot of salary systems anticipate that you have to pay a market rate. So you're right, you're not going to get perhaps progression through skill steps or salary system steps, but you will get access to the award increases.
Yeah. Thanks, GB. Does that answer that for you, Ian?
Yeah, in some ways, I guess if everyone follows the same rules, I just, and I haven't heard that my council is considering doing anything different, but I've just seen it play out differently where we've wrapped up old EAs in the past, and you've got people that are on preserved benefits that stay their salaries are pretty well frozen until the award catches up with them. That was from, and I've been involved in a number of councils where that's happened. Not to myself personally, but to some of my staff, for example. Yeah.
Ian, are those the old industrial agreements that do they go way back?
They go back to the first ones that were implemented in the 90s, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's have a conversation about that. But there's certainly been no suggestion that people that transition back to the award won't receive the award increases.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I'm just reading through the chat, sorry. Seemingly there was some advice relating to a document from 1993 to link senior staff salaries to the band 4, which seem well outside current market. Yeah, Nathan, so I've got a copy here actually of the slideshow that LGNSW has been running with their members. I don't know that it was advice. It was more talking about what, I guess, the pre-93, where people sat back in the day when there was an award sort of set point for those employees. No one should be taking a pay cut. That's the really short version of any discussions around salary system rates and where people fit. No one should be going backwards. And if you've had it suggested to you that you have to go backwards, you should contact the LGEA. That's it's certainly not consistent with the advice that any of the parties are providing to their members. Beads asked, how do we balance the component allowed in the TRP for extra hours? Will that mean a pay cut, then get it back in the form of an excess hours agreement? Look, how many ways do you boil an egg? Like it really is up to each individual as to how you work that out. And I had quite a lengthy discussion with Adam Danzy from LGNSW a few weeks ago about the hours question, because he was sort of worried about how councils would be able to demonstrate that employees are being appropriately paid and not working for free. There's no wage theft happening. He questioned whether or not members should be logging hours, for example, to make sure that their salary is correct. I don't know that we settled on anything, and it is potentially Adam being a bit paranoid about these things, but it is important, certainly for you, to think about how you want your pay structured. If it's important to you to make sure that there is that written agreement in place, like an excess hours agreement, where there's a written, documented, separate agreement which says I'm going to work 38 hours a week here or there on average, and you're going to pay me a 12% allowance on top of my salary system rate of pay, but we can revisit that, then it's a nice way to lock it in. I know that the template contract that LGNSW has been sending out for councils to utilise has one of those sort of, you should work reasonable additional hours in order to fulfill the duties of the role. Those things are always a little bit dodgy because how do we know? But it's really up to the individual. I think probably if it were me, I would have a think about an excess hours agreement, certainly just because it does allow you the ability to have it documented, but it also allows you to revisit it. It can be reviewed. But it's really, it is going to be down to each individual circumstance. I'm having a look at the chat. Jason. If I'm correct to assume that when there's no actual director's position in the salary system, does a position description need to be evaluated? So this is a question around whether or not positions need to be run through the job evaluation process. That's probably already happened, and there would be position descriptions for these roles. It's just that they're rolled up within these contracts, so they haven't been through like the JCC process probably, for example. I think people will transition across, and the award descriptions and such under the skill descriptors of the award are very clear on where your senior staff role should be. So it should be pretty much your 4 4s or 4 3s as Ian's identified. I don't anticipate new PDs will need to be drawn up at all. How are the union support members from each level that are involved? So Ray's asked a question around operational versus executive staff. We've had members in both camps forever and a day. I wouldn't say it's a common occurrence, but it probably is, I guess. It makes it sound awful, but we regularly will have a situation where one of our members has a dispute with another member who might be managing them. And within our team, we have very clear guidelines around how we handle that. For example, Brenda might have one member assigned to her, I have another, and we just treat each other like Brenda works for LGEA or something. Like we keep our notes separate, our files separate, and we just deal individually with each member. So there'll be no change for us there. Nothing changes. These people have been our members always. It just means now they're going to be potentially award employees as opposed to employed on these statutory contracts that we have been unable to influence. Robert, that's a really good idea. So there's been a request. Do we have a template request or letter, a request to transition to award letter? We don't, but I think we could very easily put one together. I'm very happy to put my hand up and say I can do that for you. And maybe we can send it out to people who've attended the webinar. Yeah, happy to do that. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm going to try and run a poll if I can. There it is. Okay. Okay, so I've put 2 questions up. Just asking people if they can identify if you're on a contract currently, and then if anyone has requested to transition. This is just curiosity more than anything, for us to be able to measure whether or not we've had a member transition and how many we have that are currently on those contracts. Now, I did have a slide on a comparison between the award and the contract, but I don't know how, but I'm having all sorts of issues with my computer and waiting on a new laptop, and it appears to have disappeared. So what I wanted to identify for you now, without a fancy slide to show it, is just some of the differences and some of the things to think about that award employment would offer. One big change is probably leave. So you obviously have the numbers are the same in terms of your amount of leave. That's always been consistent with the award, but certainly transfer of sick leave is something that's not contemplated by the contract. And the other things that are available under the award are the ability to have sick leave recredited, where you, annual leave or long service leave recredited, where you fall sick on annual or long service leave. There are some caveats around that. You have to be returning to work at the end of the leave, so you can't be leaving employment. But, if you took 8 weeks off over the end of the year and your intention was to travel to Europe, but then you end up, breaking your leg and you can't have your holiday and you're in and out of hospital, you can have that leave recredited. That's something that hasn't been available to people for a very long time within this industry, but we won that back in the last round of award negotiations. And so that's something that would be a change for our award employees when you transition, or if you transition. The other things to think about are, as I said earlier, the civil liability allowance, the right to disconnect, arrangements around vehicles and leasebacks. Again, a lot of that is probably covered by council policy, but not always. I know some senior staff have their vehicles provided as part of their TRP. So another factor to consider in that regard as well. And obviously that ability to have dispute resolution processes available to you where there is a grievance between you and your manager. You can utilise those dispute resolution processes all the way up to the IRC as an award employee. Okay, so we have about half on the call who are currently on the contract, and no one here has yet requested transition. So that's interesting. Thank you. whilst we're talking polls and quizzes, I will say keep an eye on your emails because as of I think next week, the LGEA remuneration survey will be going out to members and can be shared with non-members. So that's our biennial survey where we survey members around their experiences, their rates of pay, their employment conditions, and we publish that and make it available to members and to those who participate in the process. It's the most accurate and in-depth sort of data, survey data on local government professional salaries in New South Wales. So encourage you to keep an eye out for it, to please complete it and share it with your colleagues. The more responses we receive, the better data we have, and it's the more valuable it is for members to utilise. We share it with all councils so they get that information too, and it will be particularly relevant to this group of people as you look to potentially transition back to employment under the award. The most valuable thing you can possibly have is that accurate salary data. So yeah, keep your eyes on your emails for that. There'll also be a section specifically on senior staff and intentions to transition and stuff, just so that we can map for our own needs how many of our members are in that category, and to make sure that we can make sure we've got an appropriate resources allocated if we need to assist members in their request to transition. Does anyone have any further questions before I finish up? Or Gordon or Brenda, is there anything else that you would like to share? Cool. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate the really good questions in the chat. I think this is going to be recorded, so potentially available for people to watch afterwards for our members. But if you do have any questions arising out of the discussions today, please don't hesitate to get in contact with your LGEA official. Those details are on our website if you are unsure who in the team is your sort of person to assist you. Thank you all for joining. And oh, there's another. What's that? Is that just a thank you? Yeah. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and I'll talk to you soon.
See you all.
Bye.